Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Funny Thing About Absurd Art, Kafka and Redon. A sit-down comic named Franz Kafka, and a very funny bit he does called The Metamorphosis, Philip Roth. These drawings defied classification. Unheeding, for the most part, of the limitations of painting, they ushered in a very special type of the fantastic, one born of sickness and delirium, Joris Carl Wiesmann. Everybody, and this talk's going to be slightly different from usual. This is an overview of the people I'm going to be talking about, but I'm basically going to let them have the floor by using a public talk that David Foster Wallace, the guy on the bottom right, who I've referred to in a previous video about infinite jest, he gave a public talk called Laughing with Kafka, the guy on the top. And his basic theme was, he taught at a couple of American universities, and found that young students in particular, he struggled to express why, in some dark sorts of ways, Kafka's work is actually relatively humorous. And Max Brod, the editor and close friend of Kafka, described, after Kafka's death, how Kafka used to read out sections of his work, and he'd struggle not to laugh as he's reading out elements of his work to his friends, which might surprise some people who've read some Kafka. But it does imply that at least Kafka found some of his own material quite funny. And the guy on the right, Odil Redon, was a painter and illustrator, and I thought it might be interesting to juxtapose his illustrations alongside and after the quotations I'm going to use that refer to Kafka's work, but are from nearly all the quotations are from David Foster Wallace's public talk. Now, in his own lifetime, Redon did do illustrations for two authors, at least two that I can think of. Charles Baudelaire, who wrote a collection of lots of things, but most famously a collection of poetry called Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. And also Edgar Allan Poe, the American short story writer. So he did do illustrations for literature that he was affected by. Redon died in 1916, and Kafka's Metamorphosis was published in 1915. So that gives you some sense of how their careers slightly touched, but not really. So what I'm suggesting is I'm going to show you the images of Redon, and I'm not claiming there's any direct relevance. I just thought it might be interesting to trace this notion of both of them being absurd artists of the absurd. I find personally that Redon's work evokes, or I think it accompanies quite well, the atmosphere, the general atmosphere of Kafka's work. You may completely disagree, but it's a difficult one because I think at the beginning of Metamorphosis, the frontispiece, the front page, when it was published, Kafka didn't want an actual illustration of the cockroachy type verminous creature at the beginning of the story. He wanted it to be left to the reader's imagination. So Kafka himself had a slightly ambivalent attitude to illustrations, but I do think there's enough in Kafka, the oddness, the absurdity, and the dark humour, that I see traces with Redon's work. And if you do, great, brilliant. But even if you don't, there's a practical benefit to showing some illustrations after every quotation I'm going to use. Otherwise, it's just quotation after quotation. It's a bit tiring and boring on the eyes. So it'd be interesting to see whether this works. My plan is I may make the odd occasional comment, but I'm going to try as best I can to let the words of David Foster Wallace about Kafka's work and the illustrations of Redon speak for themselves. And Like, just to repeat one last time, these are my impressionistic associations I'm making between the quotations and the imagery. I hope you might see other links, but I hope the associations at least make some sort of vague sense. But without more ado, I'll show you probably my favourite, just as an introductory amuse-bouche for Redon's work. And I think this is quite fitting, given I've just been talking about Kafka's metamorphosis and the idea of a verminous creature with human characteristics. I understand this isn't a cockroach, but this type of image does remind me of Kafka's metamorphosis. It's called The Crying Spider. So from now on, all the images are from Redon's work, and as many as I could find I've put dates on. Some of the images don't have a date, but if I ever do, if there's any enthusiasm for a full talk on Redon's work, I will do my homework better and I will find dates for every image I can. And all the quotations, the first one is a direct quotation from a very, very short Kafka story that David Foster Wallace quotes. All the subsequent quotes are from David Foster Wallace's public talk, the link to the text of which I will put in the descriptions box. So that's the last you'll see of my ugly mug that probably compares badly next to the crying spider. So without more ado, let's get stuck in. Alas, said the mouse, the world is growing smaller every day. At the beginning it was so big that I was afraid. I kept running and running, and I was glad when I at last saw the walls far away to the right and left. But these long walls have narrowed so quickly that I'm in the last chamber already, and there in the corner stands the trap that I must run into. You only need to change your direction, said the cat, and ate it up. So that's Franz Kafka, A Little Fable. Great short stories and great jokes have a lot in common. Both depend on what communication theorists sometimes call X-formation, which is a certain quantity of vital information removed from but evoked by a communication in such a way as to cause a kind of explosion of associative connections within the recipient. This is probably why the effect of both short stories and jokes often feels sudden and percussive, like the venting of a long-stuck valve. It's not for nothing that Kafka spoke of literature as a hatchet with which we chop at the frozen seas inside us. Nor is it an accident that the technical achievement of great short stories is often called compression, for both the pressure and the release are already inside the reader. What Kafka seems able to do better than just about anyone else is to orchestrate the pressure's increase in such a way that it becomes intolerable at the precise instant it is released. Psychology of jokes helps account for part of the problem in teaching Kafka. We all know that there is no quicker way to empty a joke of its peculiar magic than try to explain it. We all know the weird antipathy such explanations arouse in us, a feeling not so much of boredom as offence, like something has been blasphemed. Kafka, of course, would be in a unique position to appreciate the irony of submitting his short stories to this kind of high-efficiency critical machine, the literary equivalent of tearing the petals off and grinding them up and running the goo through a spectrometer to explain why a rose smells so pretty. Franz Kafka, after all, is the writer whose story Poseidon imagines a sea god so overwhelmed with administrative paperwork that he never gets to sail or swim. The exformative associations Kafka's work creates are not intertextual or even historical. Kafka's evocations are, rather, unconscious and almost sub-archetypal, the little kid stuff from which myths derive. This is why we tend to call even his weirder stories nightmarish rather than surreal. Perhaps most alien of all, Kafka's authority figures are never just hollow buffoons to be ridiculed, but are always absurd and scary and sad all at once, like in the penal colony's lieutenant. Kafka's funniness depends on some kind of radical literalization of truths we tend to treat as metaphorical. Some of our deepest and most profound collective intuitions seem to be expressible only as figures of speech. That's why we call these figures of speech expressions. With respect to the metamorphosis, when we refer to someone as creepy or gross, or say that somebody was forced to eat shit in his job, or to reread in the penal colony in light of expressions like tongue lashing, or she sure tore me a new asshole, or the gnomic, by a certain age, everybody has the face he deserves, or to approach a hunger artist in terms of tropes like starved for attention, or love starved, or the double entendre in the term self-denial, or even as innocent a factoid as that the etymological root of anorexia happens to be the Greek word for longing. The comedy as literalization of metaphor tactic doesn't begin to countenance the deeper alchemy by which Kafka's comedy is always also tragedy, and this tragedy always also an immense and reverent joy. For all their wit and exformative voltage, Kafka's stories are not fundamentally jokes, and that rather the simple and lugubrious gallows humour which marks so many of Kafka's personal statements, stuff like his "there is hope, but not for us," is not what his stories have got going on. What Kafka's stories have, rather, is a grotesque and gorgeous and thoroughly modern complexity. Kafka's humour, not only not neurotic, but anti-neurotic, heroically sane, is finally a religious humour, but religious in the manner of Kierkegaard and Rilke and the Psalms, a harrowing spirituality against which even Ms. O'Connor's Bloody Grace seems a little bit easy, the souls at stake pre-made. That's Ms. O'Connor's reference to Flannery O'Connor. Her work often has religious stories about salvation. And it is this, I think, that makes Kafka's wit inaccessible to children whom our culture has trained to see jokes as entertainment, and entertainment as reassurance. It's not that students don't get Kafka's humour, but that we've taught them to see humour as something you get, the same way we've taught them that a self is something you just have. No wonder they cannot appreciate the really central Kafka joke, that the horrific struggle to establish a human self results in a self whose humanity is inseparable from that horrific struggle. That our endless and impossible journey toward home is in fact our home. It's hard to put into words up at the blackboard, believe me. You can tell them maybe it's good they don't get Kafka. You can ask them to imagine his art as a kind of door, to envision us readers coming up and pounding on this door, pounding and pounding, not just wanting admission, but needing it. We don't know what it is, but we can feel it. This total desperation to enter, pounding and pushing and kicking, etc. That finally the door opens, and it opens outward. We've been inside what we wanted all along. Das ist komisch. That is comic. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. All the very best. Till the next time. Goodbye.